How do you set boundaries with a narcissist?
The narcissistic person almost has this perfectionistic exterior they put out. I'm the best, I'm the smartest, I'm the coolest, because that's all an offset to this insecurity. But the narcissistic person is not in touch with this insecurity. That's not a conscious process.
You mentioned that being narcissistic and having narcissistic personality disorder are two different things.
They are.
Why?
So I'll be frank with you. You could meet somebody who actually has a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder that they got from a therapist, and their narcissism may not be as severe as somebody who was not diagnosed but is still narcissistic. Does that make sense?
I think that my husband or my wife or my partner is a narcissist. How am I going to identify?
But I think people get so caught up in, is this narcissism or is this not, that they don't take the time to recognize that these patterns in their relationship are unacceptable.
How do you identify if you've grown up with a narcissistic parent?
I always say it's actually quite easy to make a relationship with a narcissist work. All you need to do...
Dr. Ramani.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
I'm so happy to have you here. I feel like this is a conversation I've been wanting to have for a very long time.
Good.
I think it's very prevalent in everything we're seeing online at the moment. Narcissism is being talked about all over TikTok, all over YouTube, and all over Instagram. And I think that what I want to do in this conversation is really get to what the real meaning of it is, because I think there's a lot of confusion.
Yes, there is.
But for people who don't know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Ramani Javasala, but everyone knows me as Dr. Ramani. And I am an author, but I'm a clinical psychologist. I was a professor of psychology for 22 years. I'm retired from that position as a professor emerita of psychology at California State University, Los Angeles. I've written 4 books. This is the one we talk about as my 4th. Like I said, I'm a clinical psychologist. And I have a very popular YouTube channel in the United States. It's about 1.7 million subscribers, so clearly there's a lot of interest in it. I also run a healing program for survivors. I have the Dr. Ramani Network on the Fireside platform, an opportunity for interaction and getting questions answered about narcissism. And I also have a training program for therapists who want to learn how to work with clients experiencing these relationships. So kind of a lot lot of things happening at the same time. Yeah.
And I want to say, when you said you have a popular platform in America, I would say globally. I wouldn't say just America.
Thank you.
Because I know a lot of people are fond of your work here. And, you know, it's really your book, this book particularly, I think is going to change lives for a lot of people.
Thank you. I
want to go to the root of why you wrote this book. What is a narcissist?
So let's talk about that for a minute, because just like you said, everyone's talking about it on Instagram, TikTok, but you got 2-3 minutes, you're only going to hit this narrow definition, which is a little bit dangerous because you're talking about something that's this big a phenomenon in this tiny little way. So let's talk a little bit about that. So narcissism's a personality style. It is not a diagnosis. It is not a disorder. So let's toss that aside right away. It is a personality style. There's lots of different personality styles out there. Narcissism is one of them. Narcissism is a sort of a rigid, unhealthy, maladaptive style, largely because it means the person who's narcissistic is often at odds and arguing and sort of not engaging in the healthiest interactions with other people compared to other personality styles. Narcissism is characterized by a person who has relatively low empathy. They're entitled, they're grandiose, they're arrogant, they have an excessive need for admiration, praise, and validation. They're incredibly self-centered. Everything has to be about them. If they're not the center of attention, they get uncomfortable. Someone else is getting honors and praise, they get uncomfortable. They are competitive. They have a need for domination, power, and control. They really do have to sort of control the narrative. And so that's sort of, those are kind of they're superficial, that kind of stuff. So that's sort of the outside frame of narcissism. All of that stuff is like a suit of armor around the narcissistic person's core insecurity and shame.
Right.
And that's what's underlying all of this, right? So the narcissistic person almost has this perfectionistic exterior they put out. I'm the best, I'm the smartest, I'm the coolest, because that's all an offset to this insecurity. But the narcissistic person is not in touch with this insecurity. That's not a conscious process. But let's say somebody criticizes the narcissistic person or gives them feedback on something, or they don't get the promotion, or something doesn't go their way, and that perfectionism gets a little dented. The narcissistic person's reaction is usually rage, anger, the silent treatment, passive aggression, acting like the victim. Okay? Now, narcissism's on a continuum. It's not an either or. It can range from the mild level of narcissism, which is almost more of a an annoying, superficial, emotionally immature narcissism, all the way up to severe levels of narcissism, which are quite malignant, coercive, exploitative, isolating, and can be downright dangerous, almost feels like psychopathy. Then there are different kinds of narcissism. Typically, when people are talking about narcissism, they're talking about grandiose narcissism. The pretentious, arrogant, look at me, look at my car, aren't I great, look at my selfie kind of narcissistic person, right? But there are also what are called vulnerable narcissists. Some people call them covert narcissists. These are people that aren't so shiny and social and extroverted and all of that. These are people who are often quite cold and victimized and sullen and socially anxious, and you kind of feel sorry for them. Right. Their narcissism shows up as more passive aggressive. There are malignant narcissistic folks who are those more severe, almost sort of dangerous narcissistic folks. And then there's other subtypes too. The reason I'm giving this big description is it's not just as simple as the simplistic sort of 2-minute version.
Yeah.
And it's why two different people in two different narcissistic relationships might be having some differences in their experience. One person might be scared, another one might be quite frustrated, but the core patterns, the lack of empathy, the entitlement, the grandiosity, the self-centeredness, that's a universal across all types of narcissism, regardless of where it is on the continuum. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think it's important that we're clear on what it actually is.
You mentioned that being narcissistic and having narcissistic personality disorder are two different things.
They are.
Why?
Because to get a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, a person would have had to meet with a licensed, trained mental health practitioner in their office, probably more than once, been very thoroughly evaluated, and then issued that diagnosis, which happens almost never.
Yes, because they're not going to go.
They're not going to go. And even when they do go, a lot of therapists are sort of reluctant to give this diagnosis. It is stigmatizing. It doesn't move the needle. It doesn't inform treatment. So I'll be frank with you. You could meet somebody who actually has a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder that they got from a therapist, and their narcissism may not be as severe as somebody who was not diagnosed but is still narcissistic. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Being diagnosed doesn't make it more severe. Being diagnosed means you met with a therapist. And because even most therapists aren't necessarily trained in how to give that diagnosis, very few people will get that diagnosis. But there are a fair number of narcissistic people walking out there in the world. They're never going to get diagnosed. So I think when we make that the conversation, not only is it the wrong conversation, it confuses the conversation. And then you get all this internet sniping about people, you don't know, you're not a therapist, you can't diagnose. I'm like, don't talk about a diagnosis.
Yeah.
The personality, whether it's part of a diagnosis or not, is causing harm to other people.
Yes.
That's a fact.
Yes. You talked about the key foundations of what a narcissistic person could be, right? Because you've named a lot of things there. And I think this is also the confusing thing around what we see online is someone could be this and someone could be that. So for example, you mentioned that they must be grandiose. Now, someone could think I'm grandiose because I upload selfies of myself. Would that make me a narcissist?
I see. If somebody said upload selfies of herself, I think she's narcissistic. I'd be like, slow the train. Is she empathic?
Right.
Is she entitled? Is she selfish? You need all of it. Like, again, saying just the selfie part is narcissistic is like saying just a tomato makes a salad. No, tomato's a tomato. You need all the other stuff for it to be a salad kind of thing. You need just flour is not a cake. You need all the other ingredients, right? So, and in fact, what we know is this. Narcissistic people post more selfies, but just because a person posts selfies doesn't mean they're narcissistic. We have to look deeper into who they are.
So what are the key things if someone's sitting at home right now thinking, I think that my husband or my wife or my partner is a narcissist, how am I going to identify?
So I'm going to give you two answers to that. I'll talk about the identification, then I'm going to talk to you about why it doesn't matter, okay? So how would you identify it? You're looking for patterns that are consistent over time. Okay. So if somebody says, actually, they're a really nice person, they're empathic, they're kind, they're nice, but during the time they were doing those layoffs at work for those 2 months, they were so difficult. But then when they got into a new job, they liked everything was back on track. That's not a narcissistic person. That's a person going through an intensive period of stress. And especially if they apologize and are accountable and said, I am going through hell right now. I am so sorry. I am not myself. They might be a little shorter than usual and say, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done that. That's not a narcissistic person. That's just a person who might be going through a tough time and is very aware that they're not behaving as their best self. Okay. So we look for consistency, stability. We look for that while there might be a couple of good days or a couple of non-abusive days here and there, over time you feel you might find yourself holding back talking in the relationship, sharing about yourself in the relationship, sharing a feeling, sharing a need, pushing back on something they said, because either you don't want the argument or you find conversations with them to be really confusing and really demeaning, right? And so that, though you're looking for patterns, that's what I always tell folks. One time that they lie to you doesn't make them a narcissist. One time that they yell about something that happened in the house doesn't make them a narcissist. If it's happened repeatedly in a variety of situations, if they take no accountability, if they take no responsibility, that's when it's more likely to be narcissism. The next thing I tell people is, don't worry about calling it anything. If you can see what these patterns are and they're consistent, the reason I use that term is I think it helps people pin it to something. Like, this is something. This isn't just me like sort of imagining something. You're not imagining something. This is how this personality shows up. But I think people get so caught up in, is this narcissism or is this not, that they don't take the time to recognize that these patterns in their relationship are unacceptable.
Yes. And I think the reason for that, though, is because that person has invalidated that person's feelings so much that they don't even feel like they can say what you're doing is unacceptable, because that person keeps saying, but it's your fault.
That's right.
It's your fault. You've upset me and this is why I'm acting like that.
That's right.
And I believe the reason why so many people want to know that label and that term is because it allows them to explain as to why this person is like that.
Correct. That's exactly right. They want the explanation. But here's the thing that narcissism tells us. If once you really determine this sort of level of stability, and it really does track with narcissism, the one thing you can be pretty confident of is it's really not going to change.
Really?
And that's going to inform the kinds of decisions you make. What do I mean by that? So if this is a person you know, let's say you're in a relationship in the United States with an accountant.
Yeah.
And every year, starting from January to about May, they are not in a good mood, right? And so you make arrangements in your life. You're like, okay, we're gonna disengage at these times. You're gonna go live in an apartment at these times. Whatever it is, I know you're not gonna come home for dinner. And if a person feels up to that, and then after the tax season is done, they return to normal. I think 5 months is a long time to be difficult, but my point is, the pattern is very, very clear, right? Yes. Your tax time comes, holiday time comes, maybe an anniversary date comes each year, and a person becomes maybe more difficult. Then you might be, that's not this, right? Once you identify that it is narcissism, these patterns will not change. And I think one of the things to remember about a relationship with a narcissistic person is you go back and forth. Now, in some cases, you actually go between good days and bad days. In some cases, you go between normal days and bad days. And in some cases, you go between bad days and not as bad days. But my point in saying that is it confuses people. They're saying, but we do have some good days. Yes, but you always have the bad days. And that sets up this pattern of people kind of convince themselves that the relationship is normal enough or healthy enough because there are those so-called decent days, right? But the problem is they're always backed up by these difficult days. You never know what you're dealing with, but that builds up that muscle of self-blame. So the knowing that it's narcissism means that you know it's not really going to change, and that it is their responsibility. This is their personality style. There's nothing you can do on your side except for one thing. I always say it's actually quite easy to make a relationship with a narcissist work. All you need to do is two things. You have to give in on everything and read their mind, and then the relationship will work just fine.
I was really hoping for something hopeful there. I was like, tell me.
Well, there's
not that
the answer.
I'm in a relationship with a narcissist before saying that. I'm absolutely not. But one of the things you just said, and I think in terms of the good days and the bad days, I remember, and I wasn't actually in a relationship with a narcissist, but I do remember one thing that really helped me to realize if I should stay in a relationship or not. And it was to take note of whether it was a good day or a bad day. And I did that personally. Was this a good day? Was it a bad day? And I did it for a month. And I very quickly saw I had more bad days than good days.
Good for you for doing that.
And it made me realize that, wow, I was really, really lying to myself. And I think we want to lie to ourselves because there's a narrative right now of millennials break off relationships. Gen Zs don't have any loyalty. You know, you guys just want to change your relationships all the time. And women are so empowered that they think that they can do it all. And you'll hate men. And this is what you all want in your life. And I think it's really frustrating. It's because there's a narrative that we should stay in the abuse because we've already committed to it. And we know what they were like. You know, one of the things that people say is that narcissists are very likable people. What are some of the good traits narcissists have?
So I'm not even call them good traits because they're often traits that are still manipulating you. So traits that draw us to narcissistic people: charm, charisma, confidence. They're compelling. They're often attractive. They take good care of themselves. They're often very successful. They're often seemingly very curious about you. They'll ask a lot of pointed questions. They'll feel like they're peering deep into your soul. So these forward-facing characteristics draw us in. Right? Okay. Who walks away from a charming, charismatic, compelling person?
Yeah.
You think, well, gosh, I'm so lucky that this person's paying attention to me, right? And I'm not saying that all charming and charismatic people are narcissistic, though it definitely should be a time you're like, okay, why is this person so like this, right? I question it. Not everyone should.
Really?
I'm very careful. Like, I'm like, why are you so well put together here? So I kind of go digging. At that point, I'm like, hey, what am I dealing with here?
What do you mean by that? Elaborate on that. By so well put together.
Let me see if I can play this out for you.
Okay.
So I'm meeting you, and I can't even be charming and charismatic. This is why I can't even fake it. But like, sort of like,
I think you are quite charming and charismatic.
Hey, how are you? Oh my god! Like, oh my gosh, you're gorgeous. Like, tell me all about you because I need to get to know your gorgeosity because you're amazing.
That's making me feel uncomfortable.
Okay, but then I start saying like, let's say I know something about you, something that's a matter of heart that you're compelled about, like, I don't know, a social cause you care about, and say, you know, I heard about all the work you do and this thing that's important to you. Now you're paying attention, like, whoa, like this person cares about the same things that I care about. So you're paying attention. But what we often don't pay attention to is that almost that sense of being looked through instead of looked at. And a narcissistic person who's charming and charismatic, you sort of feel like, it's almost as though if something better walks in the door, this conversation's done.
Okay.
Right?
Makes sense.
But that charm, charisma, compelling, attractive, curious, all that stuff. And I'm not saying all narcissistic people have it. Remember those vulnerable narcissistic folks? They tend not to be charming and charismatic. But what they can be is very vulnerable. And that vulnerability can make them attractive to people. Then vulnerable narcissistic people can look like somebody where life didn't go their way. Like they're sort of they're kind of a sad story.
Right.
And so people sort of feel bad for them and may want to rescue them. And if for you, it's compelling to rescue someone, see the potential in someone, all of a sudden this becomes strangely an attractive person. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So even though like you're thinking, well, someone's sort of socially anxious and sad, is that charming and charismatic? No, I don't think we'd use those words, but could be compelling.
It's interesting, yeah, what you're just saying, because as you were saying that, I was like, oh my God, do you think I'm a narcissist? Because I am quite charismatic, and I would say I am quite like friendly, and I would say I ask people like that stuff. But when you gave the example of like, hey, oh my God, I wouldn't say I'm like that. No. And it freaks me out when people are like that because they're too overly complimentary or they're too, I don't know, I would say that would be fake though.
It could be fake, but also it could be the kind of thing where it gets tricky is I'm giving you almost too obvious an example. It's somebody who is so seemingly so into you, so interested in you, so fascinated by you. That is an attractive quality. It's why narcissistic people are such brilliant salespeople and often quite brilliant business people. Wow. Because for short sprints, narcissistic people are great because as long as you don't have to go in the long game with them, that evening you spend with them could be wonderful. The 2 days at a business retreat could be absolutely intoxicating. It's when it gets into the months and the years of real life, it no longer works. So sometimes if their only contact with a narcissistic person is in business dealings and only sporadically, they'll say, oh my gosh, I thought he was the best guy. And yet his wife is suffering miserably. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So because I think that they're sprinters, so they can really put on the show, especially if they need something from you, right? So if the narcissistic person finds somebody attractive, if they know that they have high social status, if they know they have money, if they know they have connections, whatever narcissistic supply means for that narcissistic person, they're going to go in big. They're really, really going to try to win someone over. They might be flirty in a certain way. And we got to remember this. Let's say a person was in a relationship for a long time with somebody who ignored them a lot. They weren't narcissistic, but they weren't romantic. They weren't particularly attuned. And then and then they split up.
Right.
And then that person who was in the relationship with that ignoring person goes out into the world and they meet this intensely focused narcissistic person. The comparison of the two may mean that they don't see the other stuff that's going on because this is a food group you didn't get for such a long time in that kind of ignored, cut off, or maybe that other person was preoccupied. Maybe they were depressed. Who knows? But whatever it was, this new person brings something new. But those things make narcissistic people attractive. Grandiose narcissistic people, they're often successful because they can be disciplined. They get the job done. Like a successful person in our cultures are considered an attractive person, right? There's money, there's status, they've built a company, they've done the this, they've done the that. We're taught to believe those are good things. And I'm not saying they're bad things. But if they're not backed up with compassion, respect, empathy, kindness, and psychological safety, they're worth nothing. But unfortunately, we're taught to look for the shiny thing and we don't pay attention to what's behind it. And that's how people get sucked in by narcissistic people.
So true. I mean, I think what you've just said there is really important because there's one thing being sucked in by someone romantically, and then there's another thing friendship-wise. So just now when you were saying if you met someone and they were so into you and they were obsessed with you, I think I would find that attractive in a man. But I wouldn't find it attractive in a friendship.
That's interesting.
Right? So if I met a man and he was really into me and he was giving me a lot of eye contact and he was like, wow, I love this and it's so amazing, I wouldn't be freaked out by that. And I just realized that as you were telling me. But if it was a friend, or let's say if it was a random person and they were giving me that attention, I would find it really strange. I would actually find it quite annoying. And I would have a different reaction to both.
That's interesting. Yep.
And I think that's really key as well in terms of narcissism, is that how do you distinguish?
Correct. And you distinguish it differently, like you said, and you're saying friend and romantic relationship, throw things like family and things like workplace in there, right? Because in a workplace situation, you might want to go work with a company because you're like, I've admired this person's work for so long. You admire that because they're really successful, but they might be the most awful human being on the planet. But you wouldn't know that because you're basing it on press releases and accomplishments you've seen, right? And then you go work there and you're thinking, I am in the seventh circle of hell, right? A person who comes on strong like that in a friendship may be off-putting, and for other people, it might be the other way around. They might actually be put off in that in an intimate relationship, find it overwhelming, but welcome it in a friendship where they feel like the stakes aren't as high.
So true.
In a family, we sometimes stop noticing it. Now, what is interesting is that sometimes people come from families where there'll be a family member who to the world is viewed as the person. They're pillar of the community and everybody likes them and they help everyone and aren't they great? But they're actually quite awful to their family behind closed doors, critical and nitpicking and invalidating and dehumanizing. But the world thinks this person is great. And especially if it's a parent. You spent a lifetime trying to make sense of, well, the world tells me they're great. I don't really like them, but how can the world be wrong? So people will then say, I must be a bad person for thinking, for example, my parent is bad. And then when you mix it up with siblings, aunts, uncles, even in-laws. Now, these are new people and the aunts, uncles, grandparents are going to have been around. Siblings, it might have to do with age gaps, but many people will report having been terribly bullied by narcissistic siblings. And in-laws come into the picture later on. So now you're an adult, but they're being brought into a family system. So it's a forced relationship, right? And that's where a lot of people get confused because they may, for example, love their spouse, but not the in-laws. They may love their sibling, but not the person they married. And that gets complicated because you feel like it's a betrayal of the person you love to not like these people that are attached to them. And so we minimize that. We minimize how much those relationships can affect us. But like, for example, using the in-law example, they're not going to try to necessarily be charming and charismatic. In some cases they may. In some cases they may to win the family over. But they may do that very selectively.
I think that's really interesting. And I think that comes on to the next point. How do you identify if you've grown up with a narcissistic parent? Because a lot of the things that we're talking about, some of us may not be aware of.
Yeah, so the narcissistic parent's almost like it's a different conversation because A, you had no choice in this matter. So this is not someone you picked. This is who you were born to, right? And so, and many people have grown up with at least one narcissistic parent. And that affects us in a very different way. Part of it is in a narcissistic family system, people find themselves put into roles. These roles are either A, the parent has put you in them, or it's a role you adopt to try to survive in the system. So great example would be the golden child.
Yes.
That there'll be that chosen child who maybe they look like the narcissistic parent, or they excel at things that matter to the narcissistic parent, or they make the narcissistic parent look good, or they're a particular gender, whatever it may be, that child kind of gets the lion's share of the resources. They might get benefits the other siblings don't get. They're sort of protected in a way, but it's not always smooth sailing for the golden child.
No.
Who also, if the golden child is an empathic, sort of has an innate sense of goodness, there's often a bit of guilt in that role too. There's the scapegoat child, which is the absolute other extreme. This is the kid who gets the worst of the narcissistic parent. They're often verbally abused, ignored, minimized, trivialized, mocked, shamed, humiliated. And there's even an encouragement in the family system for the other siblings to sort of pile on to that person. It's not unusual for the scapegoated child to literally feel almost a sense of complex trauma after a childhood. And then there are other roles children are put in or adopt, like being a fixer, like just trying to make all the problems go away. They're the peacekeeper or the diplomat child who's just trying to anxiously make everyone get along. There is that fixer child also may be the child who cleans the house, takes care of siblings, is put into developmental roles they're not ready to take yet, that kind of thing. Then there is there's a child, there's the invisible child, the child that somehow almost kind of gets lost in the shuffle, like no one takes notice of. You might see that in a larger family system. And most importantly, you'll see that sometimes there are children in these systems that I call the truth seer or the truth teller. They're a kid who kind of inherently, they have almost an incredible innate emotional intelligence, and they know this isn't right. Now, in some cases, they really put themselves in harm's way and they'll speak out. In some cases, they just sort of innately know. It depends on the system. That child may still be acting as a rescuer or a fixer or a peacekeeper or any of those things, but they know. Now, the reason I'm making all these roles known is that when you grow up in a narcissistic family system, by and large, most children are sort of shamed for being anything separate from the narcissistic parent. So in other words, if that child voices a need, a want, a hope, an aspiration, of anything separate from what suits the narcissistic parent will often label that child as selfish, as needy, as greedy, as you do things to benefit yourself. You don't care about the family. You don't care about me. Narcissistic parents may also go back and forth between being over-involved and under-involved.
Yes.
So when the child is doing something that's interesting to them or whatever it may be, they'll really weigh in on some aspect of the child. They may be quite intrusive with the child, commenting on their weight, on their style of dress, their friends. It's really getting involved in a way that is sort of not honoring the child's boundaries. And then at times they're completely under-involved. So the child doesn't quite even know how to evoke the parent. Narcissistic parents are very non-responsive. So the child often feels like, how do I even get this parent to notice me? And because the narcissistic parent will notice the child when it's convenient for them to notice the child tries to figure out ways. Now, what they typically find out is if I do the things this parent wants, for example, excelling at a sport they want, I will be noticed by this parent.
Right.
But what this all accumulates in is that the child increasingly feels a sense of shame because they're not able to earn their parents' love. And a child is not like an adult. A child has to attach to their parents to feel safe in the world, right? And so that child is trying to do everything to stay connected to that parent, including at times putting themselves down, devaluing themselves, feeling that they're the one who's a bad kid because they don't like soccer or chess or whatever it is that the parent that expects them to do, or they don't want to become a doctor, or they don't want to go to a particular university, or they can't get in to a particular university. And the parent never sees that child as a whole human being. They really see the child as a way of satisfying their needs, their ego, all of that. So the child also grows up feeling as though they're a bad person if they express their needs, their wants, their hopes, or their aspirations. And so most kids who grow up with a narcissistic parent wind up quite anxious, self-devaluing, a lower sense of self-worth, wondering what's wrong with them. And you can see how that could easily be a setup that if you meet an adult friends or partners or anyone, that there's a likelihood if you're treated like this in adulthood and you don't quite understand what happened to you in childhood, you'll easily fall into that cycle again because it's all you know.
Yeah.
It's a really, really awful thing to have happen to someone. And sometimes people don't figure it out until well into their 30s or 40s when they sort of start taking note. And a big wake-up call for people is when they have their own children. They're saying, wait a minute, like I'd never say the things to my child that my parents said to me. And when that contrast moment is often the times when people said, oh, this was not okay, what just happened to me.
Wow. I mean, you mentioned at the start of that one in, like, most people grow up with at least one of their parents who is a narcissist, which is quite worrying.
Many do. It's interesting. For only 10% of the population, how many people have narcissistic parents? But they do, right? If we were to estimate what's in the population is about 10%. I think that what we also have is, I mean, I've worked with plenty of people who don't have because of my practice, a lot of the folks I see do have narcissistic parents. There are people out there who don't. So, I mean, I think that no child is ever going to be aware that their parent is narcissistic. No, it's just not. There's no way a child could figure that out because it's, in a way, what the child has to do is maintain an idealized version of the parent to survive because really the parent's the only game in town. So if the child has a realization that this person is dangerous, this person's harmful, then what? It's an absolute calamity for the child. So the child naturally is going to blame themselves.
Right.
I should be doing better. I should be keeping my room cleaner. I should be getting better grades.
Yes.
I should be better. And if I was better, this would work. And that's where I'm saying that cycle of self-blame can start quite early if somebody has a narcissistic parent.
You said also that people don't find this out until their 30s or 40s.
Typically not. I mean, though I'm seeing in this next generation, because there's so much more content and information out there, people are coming to this awareness when they're younger.
So how do you spot, let's say if you're in your late 20s or your 30s, that, oh gosh, I've recognized that I've had a narcissistic parent. I think I have a narcissistic parent. What are the signs?
These are folks who might, either they're having ongoing uncomfortable interactions with their parents. They'll take notice of a parent who is very critical,
right?
Who has very little empathy for them, who feels entitled to the child. Narcissistic parents notoriously don't what we call differentiate properly from their child. They still feel like they have a right to the child's life,
right?
To intrude, and sometimes they set it up that way. So then I always say narcissistic parents are great at clipping their children's wings. So the children remain somewhat dependent on the parent.
Yes.
And what that means is that when the child goes to try to become their own person, it's harder because they didn't get those skills, right? And then the parent mocks them like, oh, you can't take care of yourself. Oh, you think you can go do your own thing? But the parent set it up that the child can't individuate and separate, right? Yeah. So they're sort of locked into this system with that subjugating parent is what we would say. So that stuckness, it's a setup by the parent. Now the parent has a child where they want them always as a source of narcissistic supply. It takes a lot for a child to cut those ties with a narcissistic parent. People with narcissistic parents may have either found that they're, again, anxious, doubt themselves, blame themselves, have a diminished sense of self-worth, struggle somewhat with self-esteem. There is a subset of kids who have narcissistic parents who are always rebellious, but rebellious in a self-sabotaging way, do badly in school, experimentation with drugs, or even self-soothing with drugs, hanging out with the wrong kids, acting out sexually. It's almost as though nothing good you do is going to get noticed. So
might as well
you're almost making psychological noise. But the thing is, it's self-harming because the things that are being engaged in ultimately are holding that child back. Then there's a subset of kids who become narcissistic themselves.
Right.
I mean, it's the smallest group. I mean, having a narcissistic parent in most cases doesn't end up in a narcissistic adult, but
really?
In a subset of cases, having the narcissistic parent was the pathway to becoming the narcissistic adult. Yeah.
I do want to talk about that, but the first thing I want to bring up is that a lot of the traits that you're describing, a lot of the characteristics are very controlling.
Yes.
How do I tell the difference between someone who is trying to be controlling towards me or if they're actually a narcissist? Well,
controlling behavior is not okay.
No.
Right. So my point is that that's what I'm saying. Sometimes we get so lost in, are they narcissistic or are they controlling? My point is it kind of doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. So it would be very, very, very unusual to find a controlling person who has empathy. What you might find, here's where it gets culturally interesting. And I say this as an Indian woman. there's a lot of controlling Indian parents. Let's just call that what it is. Indian parents have strong narratives for their kids. But I've seen Indian family systems, and I'm older than you, so my parents are going to be older, and so I watched a different generation immigrate and all of that. This was once almost a safety issue, right? So there'd be this, you cannot move around in the world this way. You have to do it this way. You have to do it that way, right? Lots of control. But it could be delivered with a certain form of empathy. Like that they would report, no, they would say, I grew up in a loving home. I did feel seen. I did feel loved, but there was no coloring outside of the lines. You had to follow that rigid path, because to not do so would actually bring tremendously problematic social shame on the family.
Yes.
Right? Like, and that would have financial ramifications, that would have literal physical safety ramifications. You know, all of those things were operating in the context that were real. So there's a case where there might have been a controlling parent, like it's this way or no way. But the person says, I didn't feel emotionally abused or anything like that. They would say it was frustrating, but there was also a clear understanding that there was a world that they were embedded in where there weren't a lot of options. Does that make sense? So that's the one time I'd see sort of that exception to that. But but the controlling parent who's controlling just because they feel that they have the right to be controlling, and those safety and stigma concerns in the world at large don't exist in the same way, that's when we're probably more veering into that narcissistic control kind of space, right? Some parents will say, listen, I struggled financially. I don't want you to make a mess of things and not go to university and have to work this kind of a job. I see that. If that's being done, though, in a way that has no empathy, is entitled, there's no awareness of their child, even if that's still a primary motivator, there is a certain element of narcissism, as though I don't even have to, my child is an object that I don't need to get to know as a human being. So even though I can understand that there is a struggle there, you don't want your child to struggle as you did, as a human being, as a healthy human being, you can have that capacity to see your child as a whole person.
The really interesting thing that you just said there is the communication element. And I think that is so fundamentally important. So I understand that some parents might be worried about their children doing particular things. But I think the empathy in the conversation is what changes the way you perceive it. Does that make sense? So
absolutely.
Let's say, for example, someone said to me, look, Shivani, I don't think that you should be doing I'll just give you the true life example. I'll just be open here. There were concerns about me starting my podcast, obviously, because how was I going to make an income from this? How was I actually going to sustain this as a business and a job? If that was said to me in a way of like, you shouldn't do this, I'm never going to speak to you again, I think it's the stupidest thing you've ever decided, do not go ahead with it, I think that would be quite worrying. If it was said in the way of like, I'm really worried about you, I'm really concerned around how you're going to provide for your family, I'm really concerned around how you're going to provide for yourself, really concerned about your future, I think they're very different things.
That is very different. I mean, obviously the gold standard would be where you start with empathy and love and encouragement, and you come into the worry piece. So where you say to someone, that sounds so interesting, tell me more about that. It sounds exciting, tell me da 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 da. And so but let's keep it real. You know, you were in a job where you made this much money, are you going to be able to make your expenses as you do this, right? And so I think it's a balance. Now I think what I'm putting out there is a gold standard, which a lot of people will not achieve. And so, but I do think there can be that sense of like, you could say to someone, I'm worried for you. Like, you were making this much money. Like, are you going to be able to make your expenses? Now, some people might receive that as being discouraging. Correct. Okay, and I hear that. But then there's a sense of like, I get it. Like, you have so much to say, versus someone saying, are you going to be able to make your expenses? And what is wrong with you that you think anybody would ever want to hear what you have to say?
Yes.
That second path, you can see if that happens in everything that child went through with that parent, is absolutely going to undercut someone's sense of self-worth, or that they have any right to say anything to anyone.
I believe that too. I think the communication element is so key when we're talking about that, because like you said, that is kind of a gold standard, especially for a lot of families where I don't think there's a lot of open communication. There are not a lot of honest conversations. And therefore, you've probably as a parent might feel too vulnerable to say, I'm worried about you, if you've never expressed that with your child. Right. And I think that a lot of the time when we're talking about narcissism, we talk about it from a male perspective. And I think if men are unable to show their emotions, which from a lot of men I've spoken to about, they don't feel so comfortable with in doing, then to say something so vulnerable like that, like, I really care about you and I'm really worried, is really difficult. So I think there has to be some kind of like consideration with that too.
Yeah, there has to be that consideration. However, what we're looking for is we're looking at how this cuts across situations.
Yes.
So nobody behaves elegantly when they're scared, right? So when a parent is
100%.
fearful for a child, certainly they may come out with like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Right? But that child or even adult child will look back and say, I've always felt psychologically safe with this parent. Because that's really what this comes down to. It's asking someone, have you felt psychologically safe with that parent? And what do I mean by psychologically safe? You could speak your mind, that you would be seen, that you could make a mistake without fear of tremendous reproach, that kind of thing. Were you psychologically safe? Would you be mocked or humiliated if you tried something new and it didn't go right? So if there was psychological safety, and then that parent does react with this kind of like, what are you doing kind of way, if you make that decision, that's very, very different than a person who's like, I've never felt psychologically safe and now you feel attacked. There's a difference. And don't get me wrong, a person would likely feel very disappointed if they've gone to someone they think is a loving, safe parent and that parent loses their mind and says, what are you doing? However, if this was a safe, non-narcissistic parent, there would be that capacity to say, okay, they're worried for me. I think I just need to go do this and show them and hear them. There's a dance going there where there's empathy running on both sides. But with a narcissistic parent, that's not the case.
You mentioned a really interesting point about making mistakes. When you make a mistake with someone who's not a narcissist, what would their response be compared to someone who is a narcissist?
So you make a mistake, and with a healthy person or not narcissistic person, they will say, even if the mistake initially, even under the worst of circumstances, like, what are you doing? But then would quickly say, okay, let's solve the problem, or is everything okay? They would touch in. They would try to work the problem. They wouldn't go right to blame, right? That's when you make a mistake with a not narcissistic person, right? I'm not saying that no one's going to get angry or something like that. Depends on the nature of the mistake. They would a healthy person would even figure out and meaningfully own what might have been their contribution to the problem too, if anything, right? When you make a mistake in front of a narcissistic person, if that mistake negatively affects that narcissistic person, they will rage at you like you've never been raged at before. If it's a mistake that has nothing to do with them, but I don't know, it's just something silly, they may laugh at you. If it's a mistake you made and they try to forewarn you from it, they will be very glib about told you so, told you so, told you so. So it's not safe, right? We learn by making mistakes and how those mistakes are received by others. So when a person who's raised by a narcissistic person makes a mistake, they live with tremendous, tremendous fear, even when it's a little mistake. Like, I don't know, they forget to bring a toothbrush on a trip. Oh my God, I forgot my toothbrush. And you're like, it's a toothbrush.
Yeah.
We're going to figure this out. But if somebody has been screamed at for every little error they've always made, even a small error brings up this massive amount of anxiety in them. That's very typical of people. It's very typical of people who were raised by narcissistic parents. Let's say a person had a narcissistic parent that was very overindulgent, right? So they're, my kid's the best. No one's as great as my kid. We are the greatest family. This is the greatest son. Nothing can go wrong, right? And that son does do something wrong.
Right.
That parent may intervene in a way that child faces no consequences. Is even told, you didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
You didn't make a mistake. So now this child learns nothing about what is considered appropriate behavior and doesn't face consequences when in fact they should. So that would be one way a narcissistic parent could go.
Got it. What are other ways in which a narcissist could show that they were angry with you?
So how are the ways a narcissistic person could show they're angry with you? Well, the first is overt anger and rage. Like they will scream at you, or they will throw something, or they will yell, scream that could get literally violent. Like that's the extreme of overt aggression. They will yell, scream, break, shout, cry, whatever. That's one.
Is the silent treatment another?
So the second would be passive aggression, which often shows up as withholding, withdrawing, the silent treatment, getting in these little digs, but they're not direct shows of aggression, right? The most common is that silent treatment. It's punishment by withholding and withdrawing. In a way, it's even more powerful than overt aggression because most people in relationships, especially if they don't know that other person is narcissistic, they don't want to lose them. So when someone goes silent on you, for a child, it induces sheer panic, right? And even as that kid gets older, it's discomfort. And when we're adults, it's uncomfortable if someone's giving us the silent treatment. It's very much a move of the vulnerable narcissistic person. That's what they do a lot of. And it's a tremendously good way to hold control.
The silent treatment is really difficult because, one of the things that I really love about this title, It's Not You, is the fact that when you have upset a narcissist, they will blame everything on you.
Correct.
And they will say it's your fault and you are the cause.
That's right.
Is that true? Let's say I've upset somebody, and I actually have upset somebody with my actions, let's just say. Don't they have a right to be very angry at me and to give me the silent treatment?
No.
Because they're so hurt.
They're hurt, then a healthy human being talks it out. Now,
But they don't want to talk it out anymore.
Okay, but the silent treatment is different than asking for some time alone. There's a difference.
Right.
So when a person says, I'm hurt, what happened here upset me, and I don't want to say something I'm going to regret, so I'd like to take a little bit of time to myself, and this evening we can talk about it.
Right.
So even they're showing there will be a time we will face up to it. It ain't going to be now.
Yeah.
But I need some time now. That's an appropriate ask. So let's say you do something that has upset someone, okay? And you take accountability for it.
Yes.
Okay? Because I think the issue here is taking responsibility.
Yes.
And taking an accountability, right? Now, we can divide things into two piles. There are some things we might do. I don't know, cheating on a partner might be an example of that, right? You cheat on someone, even if you say, I did the wrong thing, I shouldn't have done that, the partner might still say, I don't care. Like, thanks for doing that, but I'm out either way.
Yeah.
So that could happen. But let's say it's not that major a sin. It's something else that, I don't know, it was a invitation that was not given. It was a confidence that was shared that shouldn't have been shared. Whatever the bad behavior was. If we take responsibility and accountability, there's a greater likelihood of, obviously things moving forward in that relationship.
Yeah.
But we may also have the situation where a person says, and you can't quite connect it to, I'm never speaking to you again, ever. It's done. Now, when we face that kind of sort of stonewalling, and this is the only word I can use for that, is stonewalling, and the person won't say what it was. So like sometimes that will happen and a person's like, I'm never speaking to you again. You are dead to me. And you say, what, can you give me a little bit more insight? And they'll say, well, if you can't figure that out, then you're the problem, right? Yeah. So something dies and someone literally feels like I have no closure because I actually don't know what I did, right? And that can be absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
To me, that's a manipulative move to do that, to say, I'm never going to speak to you again, and I'm not going to tell you what it was you did, and you can't figure it out, which means you're a bad person. That feels like if a person wants to end a relationship in total, obviously that's their right.
Yes.
Okay? However, there is that opportunity to say, when you I know I could not, I'm not putting up with that anymore. And here's where this gets funky, because some people will say, I was in a narcissistic relationship and I finally hit the wall because it wasn't one thing, it was 10,000 things. Yes. I didn't stop speaking to them because they did one thing. That final thing was the proverbial straw. But there were, and I said, I don't want to explain all 10,000 things to them. So I was done. And no matter what I told the narcissistic person, they weren't going to listen anyhow. Yes. And so it's hard. It becomes difficult because various situations with the silent treatment and with the passive aggression can show up very differently. I know that there are people who have been in narcissistic relationships who've said, when I look back on the relationship, there were times I could see that I was behaving in a way that wasn't great with that. Like I would shut down. Got it. Again, there's a difference between shutting down and the silent treatment. Shutting down, which is what we often call the freeze response of or the flight response, more likely, of the sympathetic nervous system, that sense of, I don't even know. Like you just sort of cut away because it's the only thing that feels safe to your nervous system. That's an involuntary response, right? But the silent treatment is tactical. Yes. It's, it's when one person in a family is saying, could you tell my sister that You see what I'm saying? A person who is in a flight response and a sympathetic response, they're not doing that. But the person who's doing the silent treatment is basically, it's performative. There's a difference.
It's interesting you mentioned that point around, like, it's not just one thing, it's 100 things. A lot of the time with narcissists, they will bring up so many things that you're doing wrong, right? They will say, you've done this wrong, and you've done this wrong, and you've done this wrong. how do you know if you've actually done something wrong or not done something wrong? Because if you are empathetic, you are going to understand their perspective.
That's right.
And, you know, a lot of the times, if someone's narcissistic and they say, you've done this, you're going to be like, okay. So let's say, for example, narcissist says, you know what, you took out your lunch, but you didn't take out my lunch the night before. If someone said that to me, I'd be like, oh my God, I am actually really sorry I didn't do that. Like, I would feel bad. I'd be like, oh crap, I didn't do that. So the next time I would take out their lunch. Then they would say, yeah, but you gave me the unhealthy crisps and you took the healthy crisps. You did that on purpose. And then I would probably think like, well, maybe I did. Sorry, there was only one left. And yeah, I did actually think that you would be okay with it and I wouldn't be. So was I not thinking about your health? And you can spiral and you can think like,
yeah, you can.
Did I do this intentionally?
Right.
And even if I didn't do it intentionally, is it nice that I gave him an unhealthy crisps? I'm talking about this as a relationship. This hasn't happened. This is just
okay. But let's then go to what I was saying initially. It's easy to make a relationship with a narcissistic person work. Do everything they expect of you and read their mind.
Right.
So not taking someone's lunch out of a refrigerator is not doing a bad thing. It might be a sin of omission, but they're a grown up.
Yeah, but I would feel bad for that if someone made me feel bad about it.
So that's something that I would say that's something for you to work on, right? Because
really,
not taking someone's lunch out of a refrigerator is not a bad thing. It is, again, it might be careless. It might be a sin of omission. But my question would be, why can't a grown person take their own lunch out of a refrigerator, right?
So true.
Now, it would be a different thing if they said, would you prepare, if you're preparing the one, could you prepare the other? Because I have to leave very early in the morning.
Yes.
And you said you would, and you insisted you would, and the next morning comes, and it's not prepared, and you're like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I ran out of time and stopped making such a big deal out of it.
Yes.
Then that's a bad thing.
Yes, agree.
Right? But the person saying, you didn't take my lunch out of the refrigerator, to internalize that as you're a bad person, it's not an uncommon thing for people who are survivors of narcissistic relationships to do. But if I was working with someone clinically, I'd say, really sit with me here. Is that a bad thing? A bad thing tends to be intentionally bad. You set out to say, I am going to stick it to you, or I am not listening to you. So even in the person who might have forgotten to make the lunch, that in and of itself, I wouldn't say is a bad thing. But if the next day they say, you're a jerk for even asking, now we went into bad thing territory.
I was just going to say, for me, it would be about like their reaction. So if it was, well, why should I even make it? Like I forgot and it's not even my issue. Make your own bloody lunch. Or if it's like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I completely forgot. Is there any way you can stop off? Or like, should I run out and see if I can get you something now? That's what I think would be a normal response, but gets tricky with the intention. Because someone can say, well, you must have bad intention if you've done that. Like you knew I needed to wake up early. You knew I have a busy day. You knew that. So you forgot to make the lunch and you knew that I had to wake up early. So you did intentionally do it.
Right.
You were aware.
Right.
And
so,
that person can then, if they have empathy,
and they do.
Feel
and they
bad.
do. And that's why these relationships are so harmful. And then the other thing to look at is how much of this is a two-way street. You know, is it always you? Because relationships with narcissistic folks are death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
You didn't take the lunch out. You didn't give me the healthy crisps. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. You didn't do the other. But it's never thank you for, thank you for, thank you for. Yes. I think all of us could tolerate having some of our mistakes enumerated if it was balanced against someone noticing the good things that we do. They will never. They feel entitled to the good things you do. That's the mind reading. Right?
So
but
true.
they will not, but they will always point out the errors. And it really does get to the point where, you know, it's you might have spent 5 hours cooking a spectacular dinner and all you hear is how the food is too salty.
Yes.
Or this one dish is too salty.
Yes.
Or this one dish is too spicy or something like that.
Yes.
And so that it's that constant going for that's it's uncalled for.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. Having empathy means that you will internalize it, and that's the struggle of these relationships. But when you realize that there's no way to communicate with that person to say, hey, listen, I apologize for that, but I don't think it was a terrible thing. And they start attacking you. Oh, yeah, well, it was a terrible thing, da-da-da. And they start gaslighting and everything. This tells you that this relationship's a problem. Because if somebody's going to give you that critique and you can't go on to have the conversation, then you're stuck. There's no form of progress that can happen.
So the next question, I think this is the most important. How do you set boundaries with a narcissist?
I don't know that you do. I mean, I think boundaries with a narcissistic person become an inside game. And what I mean by that is you're not setting a rule for them to follow. You're not setting an expectation that they will follow. Instead, a boundary with a narcissistic person is you starting to realize, I'm not going to share my good news with them because they're just going to make fun of it or minimize it or be competitive with it. That's a boundary. That one boundary you set with yourself. They don't get to hear that stuff. And I'm not going to share bad news with them because they will either put me down or criticize me or make fun of me or treat me like I'm an inconvenience. So there's another boundary to set. I'm not going to share bad news with them. And then I'm going to realize I can't really talk about much with them without them making fun of me or humiliating me. So I'm going to just stick with talking about the weather and superficial topics. There's another boundary you can set with them. Sometimes you can set a boundary of time. You might say, I can tolerate my mother-in-law for an hour and a half. That's it. So I'm going to set a timer. And if the person's spouse says, but I want to stay there for 4 hours, say, great, we're taking 2 cars, or I'm going to take the tube home, or I'm going to take a taxi home. I'm not staying the full 4 hours. And the mother-in-law is going to throw a fuss. But one day you realize the mother-in-law was going to throw a fuss whether you stayed for 4 hours or an hour and a half. And you recognize that an hour and a half, you've hit your wall, and then you go home.
This is really interesting because sometimes in friendship groups, you'll have one person in the friendship group who is very narcissistic. And if you stick to those topics like the weather or the time or whatever, they could turn around and be like, you didn't even ask about me.
So if you have a friend where maybe they're embedded in a larger friend group, right? And you know that pulling away from that one friend is actually going to really destabilize the whole friend group. So you're like, it's not worth it. There are other... If you want to think of it as boundaries, I consider them sort of management techniques. People will say, I'm getting tired of just talking about the weather. I'm just getting tired of talking about superficial nonsense. Ask them about them. They'll talk endlessly about themselves. And I always say, if you're stuck with a narcissist in your group, whether it's your family you see sometimes or a friend group or work thing, I treat it as a boring podcast. So I ask them, Tell me how you're doing. I don't care about the answer.
Right.
I am just trying to keep the trains running on time. And maybe I listen to half of what they're saying. I don't interact with it. I don't, Whoa, interesting. Oh, you did? I have never been there. Tell me more about that. I don't care.
Wow.
But I'm keeping it going.
Right.
Because I know it's often in lieu of everyone else in that group because I do care about those other people.
But what about if you feel fake? Because I would feel like, oh God, I'm being fake then.
You know what I'm saying? It's like a boring podcast. Like if I was listening to a boring podcast, I'd be like, that's interesting. I didn't know that could happen in the ocean. If I was talking to a person, I'm like, really? That could happen in the ocean? So I'm like engaging with the boring podcast.
That's amazing. I think that's such a key point that you've just made, because I think a lot of the time we're thinking about how do we deal with narcissists? How do we cope with them? And a lot of the times what you've just said, we can't. But now let's say we've broken up with a narcissist. What are the key things that have allowed people to break free from narcissistic people, whether that's in a relationship or a parent or, friendship? Number
one thing is seeing it clearly. Once you get to that place where you're like, okay, this person's definitely narcissistic. This is a consistent pattern. It is not changing. That it now becomes like, this is it. Like, this is what, no one's ever going to wake up in London one day and think it's going to be tropically warm in the middle of January, right? And if you did, you'd be foolish.
So true.
And so you get your jackets and your boots and your umbrellas and you have all your things together because it's January in London, right? You may wish it was something else, but it's not like I wish it was balmy and tropical warm. So I'm going to go outside in January in London in my bathing suit. That would be a mistake. It's the same kind of discernment. So once you know what it is, you see it more clearly. Okay. Now, it's not a magical solution because these relationships hurt us and they almost at a somatic level. It's a betrayal trauma, right? We don't trust them. We don't trust ourselves. So physiologically, we do struggle in these relationships. It's not like magically, like, I get it clearly. So now it's easy for me. But that's an essential first step. The next step really becomes radical acceptance. This is not going to change. So I think the mistake people make is, let's say you're having the narcissistic person's behaving normally for a couple of days, right? Even for a couple of hours. And you might say, well, maybe I misjudged this.
Yeah.
And then you start acting normally with them or maybe throwing in some silly jokes and it all falls apart. Radical acceptance means no. You are remaining disengaged. You're sticking to the weather. You're asking them about themselves. You're not sharing the good news. You're not sharing the bad news. You're not taking their bait. You've got to be, and it's exhausting. To your point about it feeling inauthentic, even more than, I think when we are inauthentic, it's exhausting, but we're exhausted because you're in essence holding back wild horses. And those wild horses you're holding back are your true self.
Yes.
You want to make a joke like you usually would. You want to you want to share something, but you're like, if I do that, then they're going to criticize me. So it's like you're playing this game of chess in your head, 4 moves out before you open your mouth. So some people even say like, I have these awkward pauses with the narcissist now because I know if I say this, then this and that and then that. So
people will find on eggshells.
Right, you're always walking on eggshells. And that's part of the radical acceptance. But over time, the more you radically accept, the more you change your behavior, the more you're like, oh, this really is what I thought it was. And then in that period of radical acceptance, there's often a lot of grief because we often don't want this to be true. We want to believe that the parent, the sibling, the friend, the partner, the colleague, that maybe you misread it, that maybe there's a possibility there. And there's not. And when that hits you hard, it's a loss because this will never be the thing you wanted it to be. And you have to give up on that possibility. You have to give up on that hope. And that's a really, really difficult feeling. So that kind of giving up of that, a lot of people feel a lot of grief and they'll say, I feel awful. I feel more awful now in this grief than I did getting abused by them. I'm like, no, stick with it for a minute. Because as the grief runs its way through, you will get to a place where you're like, okay, sometimes you can't leave the narcissistic relationship. It's a family member or something. You disengage a lot. You talk to them very sporadically. Maybe when you're forced to family wedding, family get together, you avoid them. There's that ongoing grief never fully goes away. It's something that courses through you. You do feel sad about it. And so there's a heaviness that comes from these relationships. And over time, though, one of the key pieces is that you build out sources of social support.
Right.
Healthy friends that see you, therapy perhaps, but places where you see and are seen, where there's that reciprocity, that mutuality, that empathy. And you give the best of yourself to those healthy relationships because for most people, for the longest time, they were giving the best of themselves to those unhealthy relationships, right? So it's really about changing how it's divesting from the toxic relationships and investing in your healthy ones. And that's how that slowly, gradually changes over time. I'm not saying it's easy, and a lot of people have setbacks, and many people don't want it to be true, but that's how it works.
One of the hardest things is to accept people for who they are.
Yeah, it is, especially when it's this.
Painful. You believe that everybody wants to be better. Everybody wants to change. And deep down, I do think that everyone has such a good part of them. I do believe that. But I just think that often the fear element of some people just overrides. And I think, when people are deciding whether to leave a relationship or not, they're always trying to justify it by actions, But this happened and that person will say, no, I only shouted at you 3 times. No, you shouted at me 4 times. It doesn't matter. How did you feel? Did that person make you feel a certain way? Or did they make you feel happy or whatever? But it doesn't matter about the specifics of the thing you're talking about. Right. It matters about your feelings.
Right, but people who've been through narcissistic relationships stop trusting their feelings a long time ago. That's what's challenging. So, and sometimes when I'm working with folks, I say, let's even get away from the feeling and let's pay attention to how much energy you feel after you've been with someone.
100%.
Because that we can be more in touch with. They'll say, gosh, after I spent time with this person, I felt exhausted.
Yes.
Right? Versus sad or happy or any of these other things. They're like, I'm tired. Versus, gosh, we had such a nice time. And you might say, oh, you spent 4 hours talking with somebody. I feel great. I could have kept talking to them. And I'm like, pay attention to that.
You know what? The biggest thing I've learned is I can lie to myself, but my body cannot.
No, never.
So sometimes I'm like, you're fine. On the way to meet this person, my anxiety is through the roof.
Yeah.
When I'm around them, I feel sick.
You feel sick. Yeah.
When I leave them, I'm like, oh, thank God. But also, exactly, I feel depleted and I feel anxious. And I'm also thinking about, when do I have to see them again? Oh, thank God, never. Okay, build it up. You can push that feeling away. But it takes it out of you. And that's when I always say energy doesn't lie. Is because I can lie to myself and pretend that I'm okay seeing this person. I can pretend that I'm strong. I can have all these tactics, to do this breath work, do all these things. But on the way to see them, I know that my stomach will be churning. And when I'm around them, I will feel that way. And I think that that's how you know energetically as well if you're connected to someone. I want to talk around really quickly the healing element. How do we heal from narcissistic relationships?
So healing from a narcissistic relationship is a process, right? Again, it starts with that process of radical acceptance and realistic expectations. It starts with, I always say to folks, healing is feeling. And for a lot of folks who've gone through narcissistic relationships, they have put the feelings on the back shelf a long time ago, literally almost becoming dissociated from their feelings, right? So when feelings come in, even uncomfortable feelings like anger, I'm like, okay, good. That feeling means that you're actually allowing that emotional stuff to start coming back online and light up again. And grief is all those things. It's sadness, it's anxiety, it's anger. And so when those feelings come in, it actually means that you're not dissociated from those feelings anymore. You're allowing them to be experienced. And then from there on in, it's the experience of yourself as someone separate from the narcissistic relationship. The only way a narcissistic relationship works is if we allow ourselves to be subjugated, like living in service to that relationship.
Right.
So when you start experiencing yourself as someone separate from it. So I always say to people, some of those early wins are you don't feel the need to tell them what's going on in your life. You don't feel the need to share something with them. You don't take the bait when they dangle it. You're not playing their ground game anymore. That's the beginning of you being someone separate from them. You start developing these other social interests. You dig deep, whether through journaling or some other exercise, you figure out what actually matters to you, but you don't share it with them, right? Yes. So it's you cultivating, like, what do you, and I start with basic stuff with folks, like, what kind of food do you like to eat? What kind of films do you like to watch? And a lot of people say, I don't know anymore, because you were told for so long it simply has to be this way. So it's slowly taking that part of yourself back. It's slowing yourself down. It's being in a moment and paying attention to how your body feels in a given moment, because that a lot of people, again, have disconnected from that part of themselves. It's also about rewriting your own narrative for yourself, taking the narcissistic person out, right? Which is interesting. It's like the story of Beauty and the Beast without the beast, right? It's the story of Cinderella without the prince. You know, it's take the big story, but take that other person out and make it your story, you know, and that becomes very interesting, because the person's like, you're so defined by that relationship that you, without that, it starts to become a hazier, nebulous thing. And I'm like, hey, let's just substantiate that, because there's a whole you in there that was too scary to bring the real you forth, because it would have been shamed and humiliated. But what if you could? And so it's acting from those places, acting like, what would you do if you weren't afraid that it was going to be shamed or mocked? Those sorts of things. So those are the kinds of things where a person can sort of draw themselves forth. But I always explain to people, this is a 2 steps forward, 1 step back. People say, I was doing great, and then I saw someone at a family event. I was doing great, and then they tried to reach out to me through a DM. Like, so it is like you're moving, you're healing, you're moving forward, and then the narcissistic person comes back like a specter. And to recognize you've changed. And I also tell people, show compassion to yourself. Be forgiving to yourself. So the mistake people make, they'll say, is like, oh, I responded to their text message, or I got back into the mud with that family member, kind of thing. And I'll say, that's okay. Like it's in a way, it's almost like you're magnetically pulled to that. My question is, how long before you disengage? It might be a lot quicker this time, and that's progress.
What's one piece of advice you'd give to someone who's struggling with dealing with a narcissist?
I would say to them, I guess my question would be, if you can go, if they're struggling with a narcissist, is it because can they end the relationship or not? I guess, no, they cannot.
They cannot end the relationship.
Okay. So I would say that the first thing I would suggest that someone do is reflect on and literally write down the patterns in the relationship. Write it down, because I think people talk themselves out of it. So they're struggling, like, I don't feel heard. They always lie to me. They're constantly making fun of my appearance. They criticize. Write that down, right? Or 2 weeks ago, they compared me to my sister, da-da-da-da-da-da. 6 months ago, they made fun of me at a family dinner. I'm not, if people feel too triggered by that, I'll say, put the activity down.
Okay.
But the reason that uncomfortable step might be one of the first steps is by seeing it clearly. It's not meant to depress you, but it's a wake-up call to all these things you need to do differently, right? And whether that is disengage more, not share the good news, not share the bad news. So what you need to do is now create it's almost like you're building this other house behind your existing house. And what you're building there is, who are those people you can take your good news to?
Yeah.
And practice that a little bit. So when you get it might be a bit of good news. You get a little bit of a promotion at work. You win a prize, something like that. And experiment with what it feels like to not at all tell the narcissist, not even put it on social media, but go to your safe people first.
Love that.
Hey, I got a promotion. Now I lifted 2 steps. I have my own office, and the person who cares about me, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Tell me about that.
Yeah.
Right? And then you tell another healthy person. And now you've told 2 healthy people, and you're getting to really enjoy this good news. And compare that to the difference of when back in the day, trying to win that narcissistic person over, you'd be like, let me tell you about this good news. And they'd roll their eyes like, oh, really? Is that a promotion? You're not even making more money or something like that. They diminish or devalue your good news. Or, oh, really? You're going to tell me your good news? You didn't even ask me how my day was. And my day was actually really hard, right? So you'll think about the contrast between those two.
Right.
And you're like, oh, this was a very different experience. Then you might do it that way again. And so building up these new muscles would be that you have to recognize that it's just your bad luck that you have to continue interacting with this narcissistic person, but that you can still cultivate this really rich life outside of that relationship.
I mean, I think that's so powerful. And I think this whole podcast, I mean, we could have gone on. There's so many more questions I want to ask you, but I think we'll save that for another one.
Sounds great.
But, thank you so much for coming on and explaining this. And I'm so excited for everyone to read this book as well and read all your other 3 books as well. So
thank you.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate you spending time with me today. Thank you.
Thanks.